Namaskaram, 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 Dr. Chaitanya Giriji. Namaskaram to all the participants. Namaskaram to all our listeners on the live stream. As we enter day 11 of the FTP, today's Vishaya is India's knowledge systems with respect to science and technology. We are having a continuation from yesterday. Dr. Chaitanya Giriji will be taking us through the much sought after topic on artificial intelligence. Namaskaram, sir. We are very blessed and privileged to have you with us. I'll just take this opportunity to introduce you. Dr. Chaitanya Giriji is a fellow for space and ocean studies at Gateway House, Indian Council for Global Relations at Mumbai. His present research interests include aquapolitics and astropolitics, the new age techno-geostrategy, the space and marine industrial complex, and the science of space exploration. Chaitanya ji has worked as a planetary scientist for nearly a decade. He has been affiliated with the Earth Life Science Institute at the Tokyo Institute of Technology, the Carnegie Institution for Science, and the NASA Goddard Space Flight Center. He was a doctoral fellow at the Max Planck Institute for Solar System Research in Germany and the University of Nice in France. Dr. Chaitanya ji was a scientific crew member of the European Space Agency's Rosetta mission to Comet 67P Churyumov-Gerasimenko. Really sorry if I've got the pronunciation wrong. He's a recipient of the 2014 Dieter Rampacher Prize of the Max Planck Society Germany and the 2016 to 2018 ELSI Origins Network Fellowship by the John Templeton Foundations in the United States. Thank you so much, sir, for coming and taking this beautiful session. We've received a lot of interest, and we have about 40 participants from various higher educational institutions who are professors and assistant professors. And we're all very excited for your session. So without further ado, handing it over to you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, Rashram School for Public Leadership. Thank you, Professor Chopra. Thank you, Raghav, Namrata, for that warm introduction. And it's indeed an honor to be part of something, a project that is exalting, that is pioneering in India. I was just discussing with a speaker who was speaking yesterday at your forum, Professor Ramanathan, and we were discussing that this is such a great endeavor by Rashram and Rishihod University, where a lot of scattered efforts on IKS were being held, but you have coalesced it in such a manner that it brings a lot of people from across the streams. You know, people like me who have nothing to do with history or culture or Sanskrit. I'm the last person ever in the world to talk on Sanskrit or in epistemology and all these topics. But you weaved it so beautifully that the Indian knowledge system that the country is aspiring for, it becomes more and more transdisciplinary and does not remain siloed into humanities. So kudos to you all. And it's an honor for me. I'll start sharing my screen. I have a few slides to show, which I'll do now.
Surely.
Yeah. Yeah, I hope everybody's able to see the.
Yes, sir. It is visible.
The title slide. Yes, sir. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Namrata. So as the topic suggests, we are discussing something that is considered too futuristic: artificial intelligence, space, genetics. Uh, and in the context of Indian knowledge system, we have to now try to connect the past with the present as well as the present with the future. And in this, our understanding, a civilizational understanding of these cutting edge topics becomes extremely necessary. And my talk is exactly on that aspect, where we'll discuss why AI, space, and genetics need to be assessed and evaluated from an Indian perspective through what we know and call as Bharatiya Darshan. Because without a Bharatiya Darshan on these topics, we will be unable to assimilate it uh, within our realms, the realms of Bharat, the realms of our society, our culture, and our ethos. Because if we, without any thought or without any efforts, imbibe, let's say, Western constructs on these topics, they're not going to gel well with us. There will be some kind of clash. Uh,
Uh,
and it will
Sorry,
be a
Dr.
kind of
Chaitanya
clash
ji.
that the West had seen.
Hello.
Yeah.
Sorry, sir.
Tell me.
Just there is a little bit
Yeah.
of audio disturbance.
Let me adjust it.
Yeah, yeah.
Is it okay now?
Yes, sir. It's much better. Yes, yes. Thank you.
Much better?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. So when I was invited to speak on a topic, we hadn't decided on artificial intelligence, genetics, or space. I was wondering, what should I speak on exactly? Because the basic tenet of Indian knowledge system has been geared towards picking up the riches that we have from our ancient text, our culture, our civilizational heritage, and bring it to the current context or to the contemporary context. I had a challenge because I, as a professional, do not study history in a sense, but it becomes very important to understand that the contemporary word used in the Indian knowledge systems text, which was put up by AICTE, became sort of a launch pad for me. So I started, deconstructing and understanding where should I fit into this IKS project of Rashtra School, and I found that, look, when we look at the ancient riches of Indian knowledge, we are looking for, or we are hunting for, strategic depth. We are wanting to consolidate our narrative in a way that the sciences or the archaeological studies or the heritage, or let's say the notions that were brought to us, especially the Aryan invasion theory, are completely eliminated, but through sound scientific evidences. The problem is, in India and in many other parts of the world, knowledge hasn't been secured, or it hasn't been conserved in a way it should have been. So we find all over the world, in respective histories, many a times during wars or during battles, most of the libraries were ravaged. The places of education are the first targets. And in India's context, our places of education and our places of dharma and karma have all been at the same place. So if the libraries were ravaged or the universities in India, Bharat, were ravaged, you find that we had lost a lot of volumes and volumes of education and history and historical evidences. But when we look at the contemporary efforts like these, efforts like IKS, efforts like what Rashtam is putting in, what we are trying to do is we are trying to tactically maneuver ourselves in a way that we quickly imbibe within our narrative setting all that we have, all that we can, scrape from the bottom of a burnt barrel, and then lay again a strong foundation for the Bharatiya society and for the Bharatiya civilization. And that's why connecting the contemporary to the future is very important. So my thesis in this case is uh, howsoever vociferously we look at the past, we should also be looking at the contemporary dynamics of the world, and we should also start preparing for the future. And it can be a bright future, it can be a bleak future, it can be anything. But we should start thinking of future in a transdisciplinary manner. So where scientists, historians, people from commerce and management, people from politics should come together at places like Rashtam, where these topics pertaining to the future, can be discussed and can be contextualized. Now, here in India, we've had some history of studying the future, especially the Department of Science and Technology, which is a constituent of Government of India. It had started an institution known as TIFAC, Technology Information Forecasting and Assessment Council. And its agenda was to look at the future through a scientific manner. But over the years, in its past 35 years of existence, one has always felt that TIFAC has been looking at a very narrow domain, and it hasn't been the front runner of future studies in India. Now, you all must be thinking, why am I talking so much of future studies? Let me move on to the next slide.
Dr. Chaitanya ji, really sorry to interrupt, yes, but I think the audio problem is just persisting a bit.
Shall I join in again?
I'm not sure. I think would it be possible to use some without the earphones?
Without the earphone? Okay, let me check that.
Yeah.
Namrata ji, is it better?
Yes, it's much better now. Yes.
Much better.
Thank you so much, and really sorry.
No, not at all, not at all. I'm seeing some Zoom windows opening up on my screen. So just give me a second before I troubleshoot, because I am not able to see my own slides now. Some technical glitch from the Zoom end.
Okay, sure.
So the question arises now, does future has its place in Indian knowledge systems? And if we start asking that question, the first place where we start visualizing future is in art, it is in fiction, and it is in interpretation of Itihasa. So when I talk about interpretation of Itihasa, the first thing that comes to my mind is this, wonderful series of digital art created by a very well-known creator, Mukesh Singh. And he imagined the Mahabharata to happen in the future and not in the past. So he brought in a lot of elements which we usually relate with the future, but he connected that to the Mahabharata, which for us has happened in the past. So like for instance, in this case, you would find that the armor that Yudhishthir is wearing here is quite futuristic in its design. Although we do not have any references of what what was war during the war, or what sort of the gadgets or weapons were used, but there is some conjecture based on whatever literature we have now. But in this case, he's shown spaceships, he's shown aircrafts taking position uh, on the battlefield, and you find that the battlefield is full of gadgetry and all the gimmicks which are related to the future. But this is artistic liberty. And there hasn't been great instances where we were analyzed the future. But that's not the case in the West. So, for instance, since the Second World War, or since the beginning of the Second World War, Western industry, Western military, and Western political spheres, including the educational spheres, have been thinking of future studies. And they all began from the point of view of management thinking. That was when that was an outcome of the Industrial Revolution, which they mastered, and we were slow to catch up with because of colonization. And eventually, after the Second World War, it entered into the realms of systems thinking, then futurology. You had a lot of fiction coming out after the Second World War. All these domains were taken up by militaries and businesses and industries. That eventually led to some domains which were looking at exact stuff on exactness uh, in this line of thinking, and then there were some who were looking at the inexactness. So how do I distinguish between that? So let's say the talk of, in the Western context, the talk of oracle, the mention of oracle is seen as an inexact reference to future scene or prediction. Whereas control of information, mapping of trends, mapping of a hype cycle, which is so much used in today's marketing, today's industry, today's product design, that has become a more of an exact science. So the fiction becomes inexact, or in the Western context, mythology becomes inexact, or even history becomes inexact unless and until you have evidences, or strong evidences. But whereas on the exact side, you have domains like systems thinking, management thinking, dialectic thinking, strategic management. They've all come up in the past 60, 70 years only. So this is how future studies have evolved since we got independence. And there have been attempts in India to imbibe these domains at the governmental level, but things haven't progressed that seriously. We've only picked up all the exact thinking domains like management and systems, but we have not given enough efforts on prediction thinking. And that has happened because many of the scientists or many of the thinkers have deemed prediction thinking as something which is unscientific.
Dr.
But
Chaitanya,
there is a logic to it. If it is not scientific, that doesn't mean that
Dr.
not,
Dr. Chaitanya, this is Richa this side. Can you hear me?
Chaitanya, this is Richa this side. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
I'm sorry to intervene in between, but there is a disturbance in the sound, and can we just maybe have you log in Zoom once again?
Okay, I'll log in once again.
Just
Sure.
please log out and log in, because otherwise the audio throughout. That's the thing.
Sure.
Our worry is only that. I'm sorry for this interruption, but we are just trying to
I'll come again.
see if we could have a better voice version. For all of us who are watching on live and in the classroom, we will just see if this audio can be made better. Srihari Namrata, as soon as Chaitanya ji has joined, please
Yeah,
let
I'm
us.
here.
Yes, I think the sound is better, Chaitanya ji. If you could speak, we'll just check once again.
Okay, okay, okay. I'm sorry for this. Let me.
Yes, it seems it's very clear now that spotty voice is over.
Okay, glad.
Yes, 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 it's worked.
So let me share the screen. It's a bit slow right now.
Yes, the voice is perfect now. It's worked. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I think it is good with all the audience also. Is the voice better now? Yes. Short-term pain, but long-term gain. Thank you. Thank you so much.
So shall I start again? Or just let me know from where should I start. Was this clear? Hello?
Yes, sir. It is
Yes, sir.
clear.
Clear?
Okay. So as I was saying, the history of future studies is not very old in the modern context. It began somewhere before the Second World War, where the interwar period and the experiences of the First World War led a lot of Western entities, especially Western governments, their industries, their militaries, to start thinking about future in a serious manner. Because at that time, all of them knew that the Second World War was on the anvil. And a lot of international uh, uh, changes in the international realms, in the realms of international affairs, were forcing them to look into the future so that they can secure their national interest. And that's the reason why many of the inexact domains, like prediction thinking, started becoming exact domains. So one would find that immediately after the Second World War, new domains emerged in management studies, especially management thinking, then industry, especially Silicon Valley, started imbibing systems thinking. And many of their post-World War II innovations were based on these two lines of action. Over the years, India also started imbibing management thinking and systems thinking, especially if you look at the strategic affairs departments and centers within the government. They started, studying these two domains very seriously. Likewise, as the Indian industry grew, especially the house of Tata's, the house of Mahindras, who were the first among the first to set up strategy, teams within their institution. Those who would think ahead of times for them, they started imbibing the exact domains which I'm talking about. In this case, management thinking and systems thinking. But then somehow it became a notion that prediction thinking, which is the mother lode of all of this, is a non-scientific study area and it should not be dealt with. But that's not the case. In the past few years, especially when the World Economic Forum announced that we are now entering into the fourth industrial revolution, or better known as Industry 4.0, we started again, we are revisiting prediction thinking in the anticipation that some of the technologies that will be innovated in the coming years and decades will take some cues from the inexactness that lies in uh, concepts like magical argument, seeing future directly, control of life, the concept of oracle. In our case, it is Akashvani and whatnot. But how do we put it? How do we make it more realistic? Because many of these ideas are too fantastical to be true in real life. So, for instance, this is a study done by a gentleman known as Ulf Pilkan. He was a team member in the Siemens strategy team. And in his very good book on future studies, which he did for Siemens, he charted out this graph in which he was trying to analyze and put forth the history of future studies. And in his mind, or in the Western construct that he grew in, he started it all with the Oracle of Delphi, where the Oracle at Delphi was, prognosticating, soothsaying for King Aegeus, who was the founder of the city of Athens in the Greek culture. So for them, Oracle and his prophecy becomes the starting point of future studies. Then it goes on to the Middle Ages, when during the Renaissance, multidisciplinary personalities, polymaths like Michelangelo, Francis Bacon started discussing natural sciences in a very eclectic manner, as we call it today. Then, as we entered the Industrial Revolution, Jules Verne started writing the first science fictions for the Western culture. So this is all about the Western culture. Then, after the Second World War, as I just mentioned, the militaries were interested in forecasting because they had come up with weapons of mass destruction for the very first time in human history. So the name of Herman Kahn, who happens to be the founder of the Hudson Institute in Washington, he came up with this military forecasting aspect. Then we all have heard of Club of Rome. They started doing this group of really influential people from around the world, from around the Western world to be precise. They started doing something known as calculation of the future, and so on and so forth. As times progressed, we went ahead, and this area of study matured tremendously. Today we call it foresight analysis, and it is used by nearly all entities in the Western civilization. But if future studies was to originate in India, we wouldn't have Oracle of Delphi as our reference point. We would have, as the image on the right shows, it's a painting by Raja Ravi Verma, and you see that's Kansa. You see the Akashvani and Devi Yogmaya coming out of the womb, and she re-announcing the fate of Kansa, and you can see the terrified look on his face. So again, what happened during the birth of Sri Krishna, or just before the birth of Sri Krishna, was known as Akashvani. And in our literature, this might be one of the many references of prognostication for future telling, future reading. And we have a sound understanding of how exact that future telling is. Because in the context of Mahabharata, in the context of Charitra of Sri Krishna, you would find that the prophecy was true. It turned out to be true. Kansa was killed by Sri Krishna eventually, and he lived in that fear. So, future studies in Indian context or in the Bharatiya context is very old, but somehow in the middle times, especially after getting ravaged by marauders, we sort of lost out on this study area, because we felt that future studies is a rumination of leisure time, of peace time. And if you look at India's history in the past 1,000 years, we didn't have long periods of peacetime anywhere within our vast expanses. At any given point in time, we were always fighting with some alien entity. And but that should not be the reason hereafter, because if we are wanting to become the third or the second largest economy on the planet, we should be doing all that a strong economy or a strong civilization should do. And future studies is therefore very important. I had a small stint of studying future studies in one of my papers that I wrote for Gateway House. And in this graph, you will find that I was trying to uh, uh, show how inventions and innovations happened during peacetime, and as peacetime dwindled, many of these innovations were imbibed as dual-use technologies. So let's say during the First World War, or the years slightly before the First World War, from 1880 to 1910 or so, the Western world was seeing tremendous advances in Bessemer steel production. Uh, uh, Factories, the first factories on the planet came up during this period on a massive scale. They were mass producing. Steam engine came into the fore quite vividly. By that time, India was also well connected with railways. Powered ship travel became a possibility, and many of these technologies that I mentioned, the four of them, they all went into the gadgetry that uh, that was part of the First World War. Then, as we come out of the First World War, there was innovation on nuclear fission. There was innovation on the first fertilizers. The first fertilizer in this case was urea. The first antibiotics, penicillin, came before the Second World War. Commercial automobiles came in. Long-range air travel, intercontinental air travel began around that time. And all of these were consequential to the Second World War. At the end of the Second World War, when Hiroshima and Nagasaki happened, one would find that without long-range air travel, the two bombs wouldn't have been dropped. So it was the innovation before the Second World War that led to the war. Likewise, after the Second World War, we saw the rise of semiconductors, Silicon Valley came up around that time. The use of plastics increased manifold. Computers came in a big way. Recombinant DNA technology came in after 1958. And all of this went into the Cold War between US and Russia, and Cold War, which even today continues between them. And then the United States, especially the Anglo-Saxon world, has opened up another front of Cold War, which is with China. Now, there hasn't been a war of as cataclysm as the Second World War, but we've come out of the First Cold War with US pitting against Russia, and US's focus now is more towards China. And during this period, we see that we are also entering, the world is also entering the fourth industrial age, Industry 4.0. We see massive digitization. Just yesterday, Anand Mahindra tweeted about the number of digital transactions that have been happening in India, and India is staggeringly ahead of everyone, including China. So massive digitization is something that we are seeing. We are seeing decline of fossil fuel. There is a great furor. There is a great emphasis on use of decarbonized transportation systems. Cyber and physical systems are coming together in a very big way. Genetic modification, CRISPR, is again something that is not understood by most of us, including me. But it is something that is worrisome. And it is believed that all these technologies will be used in the next war. It could be an extension of the Cold War. It could be a second Cold War between US and China, but it could lead to the Third World War. I'm not conjecturing what will happen, but the reality is most of these technologies will go into the direction of becoming weapons or facilitators of weapons. And once we go beyond that, after 2040 or so, we'll find that nuclear fusion, which has been impossible until now, will become possible. Humans will interface with robots. There will be incessant situational awareness. uh, due to surveillance, camera surveillance, due to surveillance from satellites and whatnot. And long duration space habitation will be possible. So what we are trying to do in this graph is we are trying to connect. I made this graph last year in 2020. And what I was trying to do was connect what happened in 1880s in the past, contextualize in the present, and predict or try to predict what sort of future we might look at. Now, when we talk about future, when we talk about science, we can't really ignore the role of religion. And again, in the Western context, which is quite evident in India, which is quite prominent in India, for them, the religion and science do not sit in the same bracket. They do not sit in the same ship. They are at loggerheads with each other. And that's why whenever there is an inquiry on a question which even science can't understand, both these domains try to fight with each other. So let's say, for instance, about the discovery of alien life. Now, through science, we haven't been yet able to find alien life from other solar systems or other universes or other galaxies. But there is some reference to it, which is much older than modern science, and that is based out of religion. And this is a headline of an article, very good article. I suggest you to read it and not imbibe it, but just read it for your own curiosity. And it says, how will our religions handle the discovery of alien life? Now, the article is asking from a Western vantage point, and he's not yet sure whether the religions will take it lightly or how will they respond to the discovery, because there is an assumption here, underlying assumption here, that alien life will be found through scientific advances. So there is a certain dichotomy, there is a sense of disparity between religion and science in their understanding. Now, this is something which we shouldn't be imbibing at all, because in our case, our interpretation of science is quite different. This is again a very good study done by Max Tegmark and his team at MIT Kavli Institute. MIT Kavli Institute does not study religion, it does not study future. It is an astrophysics oriented institution. It studies pure astrophysics. Their people are doing theoretical astrophysics, they are astronomers, they go to observatories and whatnot. But in this study, they sort of got interested in understanding how would different religions respond to these factors, which we usually connect with science. So a large proportion of all the religions on the planet, of most religions on the planet, will find no conflict between science and finding life elsewhere or finding origins of life. But then there are certain sects, let's say within Christianity, especially Lutheran Christians, Presbyterians, the most being Baptists, Adventists, Jehovah's Witnesses, Pentecostals, and all those. Their religious theology and science are not congruent. Modern science are not congruent with each other. Whereas in the case of most Oriental religions, including if we call it Hinduism, Sanatana Dharma, we find no conflict between finding life elsewhere or origins of life or origins of the universe and our thesis, because most of our treatises, most of our literature is in conjunction, is congruent with the modern scientific understanding. And that's why whenever we come across, let's say, a quote by Carl Sagan or Robert G. Oppenheimer, when he talks about Sri Krishna, Carl Sagan when he talks about Shiva, we are actually relieved as Indians, because that's a good pedestal to be on. That's a good point to be on. That your culture is not in conflict with modern science, and this is something which gives a really good high to all of us, Bharatiya people, and we shouldn't stop there. This is what I'm trying to say. This is again a new book called as Exotheology, uh, Theological Explorations of Intelligent Extraterrestrial Life. And it is one of the very good attempts in the Christian world to connect their religious treatises, modify them in a way that they become congruent with modern astronomical discoveries and whatnot. And it is again one of the good attempts within them to connect religion and science. But as we saw in the previous graph, not all of them are finding that congruence, and this is of concern. But those who are finding congruence, they are writing such literature, and it's a very good attempt to come out of the cycles of ignorance and accept the realities of modern times. So, I mean, you find there is a testimonial written by somebody from the Vatican Observatory. Vatican has been, maintaining an observatory, an astronomical observatory for a very long time. They have assets in Europe, they have assets in North America, and these assets are used for making really good scientific discoveries. And they also put in a lot of money from their side to fund science. In our case, we haven't thought of any temples or any temple trusts to support scientific discoveries of the modern kind yet. We do go into a lot of philosophical inquiries, but funding of science from temples should be something that we should aim for uh, in our civilization's attempt to get the government out of temple trusts. I'm going away from the core topic, but yeah, this is the role of Vatican Observatory in the publication of this book. They've given a strong testimony to it. Then on the right hand side is a very interesting book which was reviewed by our friend Arvindan Neelakandan in Swarajya, Islam, Science Fiction and Extraterrestrial Life, the culture of astrobiology in the Muslim world. Now in this book, not written by a Muslim person, but a European, Jorge, whose name is written on the top. This book is about how would the Islamic world respond to respond to the finding of alien life. What if, let's say, alien flying saucer falls in Saudi Arabia, or what if it falls in Turkey, or Iran, or Iraq, or even in Syria, which is right now infested with ISIS? What if? So again, this is something very interesting, which mainstream academicians won't discuss, but these are the topics which go unanswered for a very long time. And I feel this is again a very good book to explore the connection between religion and science and how they can accept each other by assuming a moderate stand. Then there are, people from the extreme of the science who are who claim to be atheists and scientific minded, and they believe that since in the past few years or few decades, despite consistent attempts, we have not been able to find alien life. They believe that the belief in aliens may be a religious impulse. Now they so they blame it on religion, that the need for search for aliens, the need to search for aliens is a religious urging of people. It could be a Christian urging, Hindu urging, Islamic urging, or whatnot. But they blame it on religion. Now we also have to be beware of such attempts where an extreme stance is taken in favor of science. Now coming to the core topic, I've given you the brief about why future studies is necessary, how religion and science, modern science, and grand questions are connected. And I'll pick three of them: artificial intelligence, genetics, and space. So starting with artificial intelligence. Whenever we think of artificial intelligence, the exact technical word used is cyber physical systems, where the cyber world, the virtual world, is getting connected with the real world. And in several, governmental reports, intergovernmental reports, reports coming out of think tanks, reports coming out in popular media, they all show this image on the right hand side, where there is a hand of the robotic world, of the artificial world, and then there is a hand of the real world. And it has some cultural connotations for the West, because uh, similar looking art is present in the form of the god of hand and Adam. So when the West starts to interpret AI, when it starts to form ethics, ethos, etiquettes, regulations for AI, their thought process will come from references that are deeply embedded in a Western mind, in the Western psyche. So, I mean, it is but natural that the artist who's drawn this diagram, this new diagram on AI, has taken a reference from the god of hand painting. And this is where the issue is. Every culture, every civilization on this planet should be able to have its own interpretations of cutting edge technologies. And we do have an interpretation. Even in the Bhagavad Gita, Lord Krishna, in his sayings to Arjun, says that the working senses are superior to the inanimate matter, in this case, the artificial matter. The mind is higher than the senses. Intelligence is still higher than the mind, and the soul is higher than the intelligence. So we have certain understanding of what intelligence is, how intelligence should be interpreted, and why the soul, which is currently an unanalyzed aspect of human understanding, is higher than intelligence. Why did Lord Krishna say that? The soul is higher than intelligence. And that's why, as we study AI, inquiries on Hindu understanding of AI must also begin. And that's why, in my topic, I've used the word AI. Now, coming to space, again, I've given you examples of how the Vatican City supports scientific pursuits in astronomy, and they have been relentless in bridging the scientific world and their religious worlds. So the cover of the book that I show on the right hand side is God of the Big Bang. How modern science affirms the creator. Now, this is one of the extreme, attempts to put the creator before the Big Bang, before the singularity, and say that God existed before the singularity point. It's a good attempt. I am not going to argue on that, because of the many shades of attempts to bridge science and religion. This is one of it. Then there is a more restrained effort on the left-hand side, understanding scientific theories of origins, cosmology, geology, and biology in Christian perspective. Now, as the title suggests, it is coming from a Christian perspective, and there should be attempts to not let this perspective be the only perspective, because in a democratic setting, you need to have multiple perspectives. And when I say democratic setting, I'm not talking about the Indian sovereign territory, but I'm talking about the world democracy. That we need to have multiple perspectives on cosmology, geology, biology, scientific understanding of origins, and all these, grand questions that plague all of us irrespective of religions or irrespective of our affiliations. Now, we also do have a good understanding of Big Bang, if we can say that. That in the Nasadiya Sukta of Rigved, it is said that one out of which all the creations came may hold the reins or not. So the Nasadiya Sukta takes it takes a middle ground, and it says that we don't know. So it is confident enough to say that we don't know. Perceiving from all about that one alone knows the beginning or maybe not in knowing. So somebody in the beginning may be knowing what's happening or not knowing. We don't know. So that's a very rational way of looking at things. And it ends with Veda Yadi Vededi. No one knows, no one knows, no one knows. So nobody knew what happened before the Big Bang. But then the science is trying to say something, and apart from science, then there are there is Christian understanding. In the coming years, there might be a Muslim Islamic understanding of Big Bang, and in all this, we should also be able to start interpreting and setting up narratives from a Bharatiya vantage point. Coming to the last, genetics. This is a nice picture taken from the Creation Museum, which is in Kentucky, USA. Nice museum, really great artwork, really great, figurines and figures of dinosaurs. This is a dinosaur known as the Utahraptor. It's just like the Velociraptor that you saw in Jurassic Park and all those movies. And what's interesting in this picture is the card, the poster which is just kept beside it. So starting with man's word. So science is a man's word. And it says that the Utahraptor lived in the early Cretaceous about 125 million years ago. And it evolved through millions of years of change. They don't call it evolution, they call it change at the Creation Museum. It's a very creationist way of deducing and describing science. Whereas on the right hand side, it says the Utahraptor lived in the pre-flood world. So for the creationist, it starts with the flood. And they time the flood about 4,300 years ago. And it says that God made the beasts of the earth, which is written in the Genesis. Now, Western science, as we all know, has been antithetical to Western religiosity. And they've accepted the fact, they've accepted the way the Utahraptor looks. They've accepted the physiology of the Utahraptor. They've shown it nearly correctly. They've shown the exact number of teeth. They've shown the exact skin that it has. They've shown it exactly as ferocious as it is to the scientists and geologists and archaeologists. But what they're trying to play with is the timelines. So an organism, a dinosaur that has lived 125 million years ago, in the creationist concept, it lived only 4,300 years ago. And this also reflects in the Western interpretation of Indian history, because they are quite insistent on restricting our history to not more than 2,000, 2,500, because that starts clashing with their creationist notion, which we call it as the God's law. So one has to take this into consideration. I'm giving you a complete reference point about Western interpretation of Indian history and why they shrink our history deliberately, because this is the reason. They not only shrink thousands and thousands of years of Indian history, but they also shrink the millions and millions of years of history which has archaeological evidences or which has fossil evidences. So something which an organism which is said to be living millions of years ago and that has been confirmed by dating mechanisms, but they go on to say that it lived only a few times. This sort of concept doesn't exist in our case because we have a very vast understanding of time in our Bharatiya Darshan. I mean, in the modern times, at least I haven't seen anyone who's been able to exactly, put a kalpa and years on the same track, Manvantara and our understanding of time on the same track. We've recently, a lot of professionals out of their free time, they've started studying the yogas, and but this sort of effort needs to increase, and for that reason, there needs to be some astronomical inquiries on Kalpa using scientific instruments, so that uh, you know the scientific world doesn't remain bereft of the vast Hindu understanding of time. Now, the last part of my talk is most religions of the world are reinterpreting their worldview due to science. It can be the Buddhist world, it can be the Christian world, it can be the Hindu world, and nearly all of them are reinterpreting the religion because most of their ideas, which have been put down in text, they believe a lot in text, and these texts are finding themselves limited when it comes to rationalizing modern science. And in this case, you've seen a nice artwork done where an astronaut is shown with the pose of Lord Buddha. An astronomer here, an astronaut here is shown. Uh, he's trying to symbolize the last walk of Jesus Christ, and we haven't put an astronaut in such contextual paintings ever, but people are now forced to put science in their religious connotations. Again, the Islamic world is also not far behind. Some of the stable economies in the Islamic world, let's say Indonesia, Malaysia, UAE in the recent past, Jordan, who had the liberty of doing some, modern education. They've had the liberty of setting up good universities where Western educated or people educated in India, a lot of Southeast Asian Islamic countries, and people from them come to India for education. So once they go back, they take away, they take with them, uh, the worldview that they absorb from India. So likewise, they have found ways to use artificial intelligence in Islamic investments. They are now, conceptualizing how to develop a robo Islamic advisor, how to do algorithmic trading with Islamic, ethics and morals, and how to pick up a stock and whatnot. So it's seeping in. In the past few years, you've seen that United Arab Emirates have made tremendous strides in space exploration. So early this year, the first ever space probe from an Arab world, from an Arab country, went to Mars. Although it went with really good support from the Japanese and Americans, but it's a momentous feat for the Arab world because they are now able to do all that, which was not expected from them, let's say 10, 15 or 20 years from today. They've done it at a very rapid pace, and many of these capabilities are known only to countries like India. We went to Mars in 2013. China, United States, Europe, Russia, and Japan. So UAE has gone and embedded itself in that club of Mars exploring countries. And once it does that, I mean, one has to be pretty sure that each of these cultures, the Japanese will look at Mars with a very Buddhist way. The Europeans and Americans will look at it very Christian, either Christian or communist way. Uh, of course, UAE being Emirat, a collection of kingdoms, they will look at with Islamic ethos, and we should be doing that with our missions as well. And we are doing it to an extent. So coming to the conclusion, why is studying future necessary? Because we believe in Trikal Darshan. We believe in the darshan of the Bhutakal, the Vartaman and the Bhavishya. And to have a good darshan of the Bhavishya, we need to put in efforts. And again, as said in Bhagavad Gita, oh Arjun, I know of the past, present, and future, and I also know of all living beings. But me, no one knows. So our understanding of the supreme forces that govern the universe will only come if we start studying the future. If not, no, as vociferously as we study the present or we study the past, but at least give 10 to 20% of all the resources that you put in to studying the future, because it will go a long way. And I show you an image of Nataraja, which was offered by Department of Atomic Energy of Government of India to CERN, the nuclear research laboratory in Switzerland. So what are the takeaways from my lecture? Number one, humanity is undergoing a massive catharsis due to fast pace of innovation. And that catharsis is seen in climate change, that catharsis is seen in the impact of religion, the impact of science on religion and whatnot. Major religions of the world, including the SBNRs and the atheists, atheism is also a religion, as mentioned by Mike Dobbins. They're all attempting to absorb modern science in their respective worldviews. And today, very few communities and tribes in the world are disconnected from modern science. There could be tribes like the Jarawas from the Andamans who have not yet come in contact with the modern life. So they are disconnected. And then there are certain tribes who have deliberately kept themselves away, like the Amish people of North America. So they stayed away from modern science. But the rest of the world is all connected to modern science. The Bharatiya Darshan has readily absorbed modern science. I mean, since the times of Swami Vivekananda and his trip to Chicago. But a sustained effort to analyze the absorption and dissemination is necessary. We need sustained efforts, and IKS is one of it. The efforts are crucial because Bharatiya populace would not want to live under alien interpretations. So my talk was all talking about alien interpretations which are not native to India. And if we start imbibing these interpretations, they won't merge well with the social, cultural, economical, ecological, and scientific fabric of Bharat. That's why a native interpretation is extremely necessary. And it is extremely necessary for civilizational Atmanirbharta. It's not just restricted to manufacturing, or it's not just restricted to indigenous production. Indigeneity is also important for civilizational growth. And I end my lecture with this. And I'm happy to receive your questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chaitanya ji.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chaitanya ji.
I think it was a very enriching session. Thank you so much.
I think it was a very enriching session. Thank
Okay,
you so
if we
much.
take some questions.
Okay, we take questions.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I think there is an echo.
Yeah, I think there is an echo.
If there are any questions from the participants, if they could
if there are any questions from the participants, if they could kindly
I see there are 2 pointers in the chat. Okay, nothing. Those are not questions.
We could also type in our questions in the chat box.
You can also type in our questions in the chat box.
Yeah.
Yes, Dr. Rajatji, please go ahead.
Yes, Dr. Rajat, please go ahead.
Nice, certainly. Wonderful talk. I just want to ask one question. How do they define intelligence in the first place? Because artificial we understand, but how do they define intelligence as far as the structure and function are concerned?
As far as the structure and the function are concerned.
So they, as in, we are talking of several cohorts in this case, several groups. So if we talk about the scientific community, which does not affiliate itself with any religion, it has some understanding of intelligence. It comes from the domain of psychology. It comes from the domain of physiology, and then it comes from the domain of medical statistics, where we start measuring the intelligence quotient. And then there is interpretation of intelligence from the point of view of computation, in terms of how many computations can a certain entity, it could be a biological entity or a mechanical entity, how many calculations can it do within a certain period of time. So this is how the scientists look at it. Now, when it comes to religious understanding of intelligence, it is not coherent, but it varies from societies to societies. So societies within a certain religion will look at intelligence or the concept of intelligence in a very different way. Many of these understandings are shaped by the environment in which these societies live in. So, for instance, a society living in a desert region will interpret intelligence completely differently than a society living in a evergreen forest or in a mountainous region. When it comes to religion, there might be a few instances where certain texts are talking about it, but the notion of intelligence comes along with the wider interpretation of the world. So, for instance, there are interpretations of intelligence in Bhagavad Gita, but then the aim of Bhagavad Gita, when it was delivered, was not to explain intelligence to Arjuna. Okay, but it was the notion was part of a greater worldview that Sri Krishna was trying to invite into Arjuna and take the decision, take the call. So, as far as religions go, they have only recently began to interpret intelligence, like in the case of Islamic finance example that I just showed you. But it is not comprehensive. It is very limited to certain domains. So they might interpret it for certain applications, if I may put it. So in this case of the Islamic banking example, the banking is an application. And they are wanting to interpret it in a way that the Islamic ethos are put in while banking. And all the algorithms are developed in a way
It's
that
basically it's computational intelligence.
It's basically it's computational intelligence.
The other aspect means creativity, for example, that's not there.
The other aspect,
Any kind of emotion is not there.
that's not there.
Other discerning abilities of an intelligence, but whatever is possible by computer.
Discerning abilities of an intelligence, but whatever
It's only computational intelligence that we are talking about.
computational intelligence that we are.
yes. In the current context, with artificial intelligence context, we are only talking about computation. Yeah. Because
Yeah.
the other reason being that one has to also bring in the aspect of how lucrative it is. Competition is lucrative in today's world, whereas many other factors that we just mentioned, they are seen as abstract. Unless and until there is an economic return to it, it won't be pursued. Now, for instance, human behavior, societal behavior
Yes.
is being mapped by social media companies, because for them they have a lucrative profit coming out of it. But as far as academia is concerned, or as far as other domains are concerned, we are not looking at it because most of our potential funders are not giving us money for that purpose.
All right. Thank you. Thank you very much. All right. Thank you. Thank you.
We have one more question in the chat. Dr.
We have
Ashima
one more question in the chat.
She's writing, Dear Chaitanya ji, Pranam. It was very enriching session. It is basically the consciousness which works as an intelligence, experience, stimulus, and response. How all these natural factors can be inoculated into the artificial system oneness. It is a natural organismic whole. So I think Ashima-ji is expressing her wonderment for this session. Ashima-ji, would you like to add if you have any specific question? Sorry, you are on mute, Ashima-ji.
This is my question, Madam Namrata ji. This is my question, that this fundamentally this consciousness which is in the organism, that only works as the intelligence, experience, stimulus, response, whatever feelings, everything. And how all these natural factors can be inoculated into the artificial system unless it is a natural organismic whole.
Yeah.
Am I audible?
Yeah. So, I understood your question.
Yes.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you. We are doing a very poor attempt at replicating. We as in humans, we are doing a very poor attempt at replicating an organismic whole by bringing in several sensors. So artificial intelligence, when you see it from if you put it in a robot, in that case, that robot is an agglomeration, it's a collection of various sensors. And that sensors, they are supposed to feed in data to the core of the let's say the chip board or the processor, in a way that the processor becomes the brain, the sensors become all the sensory nodes. Then being a robot, the robot may have arms or appendages which could be going out to receive a certain signal, and that signal is then interpreted by this motherboard. Now, in all this, one has to understand that we as in humans are doing a poor attempt of imitating the natural world. So we are not doing anything outlandish. So while we make a robot, we make it anthropomorphic. It looks like a human many a times. Okay, it may look like a dog, and most of the functions that we are trying to put into that robot is a way of replicating what we understand out of that organism or that organismic whole. But it's still a poor attempt because we've just begun doing it, we don't know how to put in experiences. We may be able to put in stimuli and responses through sensors, but experience is something that we don't know how to put into that robot or into that AI system. And whether it will take an ethical call. So we haven't yet trained robots to become ethical, to follow certain norms of your own society or the society of the innovator. And that's why when I give this talk. My aim is to say that, look, when Silicon Valley will build robots, when Europe will build robots for AI, they will do it entirely from their perspective. When we have to build robots here, let's say in Gurugram, or let's say in Bengaluru, in Pune, or Hyderabad, we'll have to make sure that whatever we innovate here in this country is built through our own worldviews, the Sanatani worldview. Because it won't gel well if we bring in robots with, let's say, Christian etiquettes or Islamic etiquettes. And by this religion, I won't even pinpoint religions here. I'll pinpoint, like for instance, there are several people in India who would want to have a husky dog as a pet, a Siberian husky as a pet. The Siberian husky is not meant to live in India. So it doesn't gel well. Very similarly, you have to create new organisms, be it robotic or new intelligences, be it artificial, with your own etiquettes and ethos. Because at the end of the day, they are going to serve you.
Absolutely. I think Ashmaji has also responded saying that means it is just putting some experiences in the memory of the artificial system in a programmed manner. Sorry, sir, you're on mute.
Yeah, exactly. Ashimaji, exactly. And the next question would be, how much memory can that AI processor carry, and which memory would it use at a, let's say, a time of crisis, or let's say a time of urgency? That is something that we need to know. If the AI system, if the AI system is driving a car, and if on the road it has had an experience of just going and hitting into a, let's say, a person, or they're hitting into an object, will it carry that memory the second time? So it should know what is to be done and what is not to be done. So right memory at the right time. Wrong memory at the right time won't work.
Absolutely, sir. And also, if I can just add my 2 penny worth of experience in this also, like, we cannot have pre-programmed responses, because that is exactly what kind of differentiates a human being, right? Like, to use that vivekam in each and every experience, and not just act from a past memory, from a past experience, because every engagement in a sense is new. So that is really, I think, what I believe differentiates us. If there are any more questions, you can kindly put it in the chat.
Namrata,
Yeah.
programming you just mentioned, there are chances of inserting biases. And biases come from your upbringing, your cultural moorings, and that's where religion, even if somebody is an atheist,
We also have one question from Dr. Sheetal Ji. She has mentioned here we are able to see the limitation of the much glorified, much over-evaluated, over-ambitious promises of the future technologies. I see it more as an analytical tool.
yeah, exactly. Who made it over-ambitious? Who glorified it? The problem here is that the innovators and the innovation companies tend to oversell, and overselling is overkilling. So they've oversold the technologies. Many of us have fallen for it completely, and that's why we've never cared for a greater analysis and understanding of these technologies and tools. I mean, through this lecture, what I'm trying to say is that we not only need to analyze it from its from an economic purview or a technological purview, we'll also have to analyze it from a cultural and civilizational purview. Because even in our itihas, even if we talk, let's say, of Ravana, I mean, Ravana's Lanka was endowed with all the resources that were present in his times. So maybe we also related with the perhaps the richest kingdom in the world. I mean, his access to Kuber, his access to the treasures of Kuber gave him all the necessary resources and wherewithal. And it also made it difficult for Lord Ram, Prabhu Ram, to conquer over him. Similarly, exactly in the same manner, all the gizmos and gadgets that are being developed by the economically or the militarily superior countries of the planet, we have to understand that look, not all of these technologies will be able to fit in our world, in our neighborhoods, and that's why by not falling for it and doing greater analysis of it, we'll be able to save ourselves. Otherwise, it's just like a flood. It will come in and it will just pull you into the tides and currents. And again, reiterating, we have to analyze it at a very deep metaphysical civilizational level, whether it is good for us.
Absolutely, sir. Very, very enlivening session. Thank you so much.
Enlivening session. Thank you so much.
If there are any further questions, maybe we can send it to you on email if that's fine with you. And thank you so much for joining us, and thank you so much for the session. It was very fruitful and very, very enlivening. Thank you.
Thank you, Namrata. Thank you, Rafika.